tell us who can apply for an E-2 visa?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So basically what we need to know on that is that the applicant has to be a national of a treaty country. The E-2 visa is based on a treaty. So applicants must be from countries that participate in that treaty. So you're looking at countries from all over the world, including Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. More specifically, you're looking at countries that are the United Kingdom, Mexico, Canada, Japan, and Chile are also included. There are many others that are on a list that are participant countries. There are countries, obviously, that are not participants, such as China and India. And another point to understand is that the applicant must be a national of that country. So they really only need a passport to be able to qualify. They don't need to have been born from one of the E-2 countries. So the passport by itself will get them eligibility for the E-2 visa.
Perfect. Thank you, John. And so could you go over for us, what is an E-2 visa and what are the key requirements to get one?
Sure. So an E-2 visa is basically what's considered a non-immigrant visa. What that means is that it's not really a status or a visa that's going to get you to legal permanent residence status or a green card. It's a visa for a temporary period of stay, which again allows nationals of certain countries to come to the U.S. And this is very important to understand. They're coming to the U.S. to develop and direct the operations of a business or an enterprise in which the applicant has invested money in. Some options for obtaining an E-2 visa can include purchasing an existing business or franchise, or they could be starting a new business in the United States. Another key eligibility factor is that the applicant must own at least 50% of the E-2 company. So it's not permitted at all to drop below that 50% mark, because then they will be disqualified. The applicant must make an investment in the U.S. that is considered at risk and substantial. It's expected or it's required that the money be spent before actually applying for the visa. So that's maybe one of the potentially scary parts of the application, where the actual investment has to have been made towards the business to qualify. Now, there is no minimum amount, but it is expected that the investment must have been substantial, and it's typically comprised of expenses required to start the business. The applicant must also show that the money for the business that's used to invest into the business comes from a legitimate source, whether that's a gift, a loan, or from saved earnings. It's important that that money does not come from illegal or illicit activities. The business cannot be marginal, or in other words, it can't be set up just to provide support for the investor or his family. The whole purpose of the visa is to provide future ability to employ U.S. workers. Now, typically, we usually advise clients to consider employing or be prepared to employ 3 to 4 employees within the next 5 years of operations of the business. The business must also be real and operating. So that could either be where the business is operating, taking revenue, or you're able to show that it's ready to start. It's ready to start running once the visa is granted. Some examples of the fact that the business is real and operating could be providing a signed commercial lease, that the business entity in the state where it will be incorporated has been established. The company website has been created. There are pending contracts with potential clients. Required licenses for the type of business activity have been acquired. So these are different examples that could show that the business is ready to operate, or perhaps is operating. The investor is coming to the U.S. to solely develop and direct the business. That's key. He's not coming in as an employee or a worker. He's coming in to manage it and develop it to help it produce further revenue, and again, hire those employees as the business continues. Finally, the investor must have the intent to return to the home country upon expiration of the E-2 visa. This is typically not too difficult to show. We usually have our clients sign a declaration, which communicates this intent that they're intending to return to their country once that visa status expires. But those are probably the key requirements for the E-2 visa.
Perfect. Thank you, John. So now we know the requirements, we know who can apply. So how long can you get an E-2 visa for? How long do the visas last for?
Sure. So that's going to depend on the country of nationality. Not all countries have grant the same amount of time. Many countries can allow for a visa to be granted for up to 5 years, but there are some who can issue the visa for a shorter amount of time, depending on their reciprocity status with the United States. So some countries could grant a visa for as little as 3 months, 6 months, a year. Again, depending on the country, it could be up to 5 years. So you'll need to check what that period of time will be with the country of nationality. Regardless of the length of the visa is the document that lets you come into the United States. And a visa holder will be admitted at the Border Patrol checkpoint or at the airport checkpoint for a period of 2 years, regardless of how long that visa actually is. Even if it's for a few months, they'll be admitted for 2 years. And on that, it's important to note, the visa validity period is the time you're allowed to travel to the United States. Again, that's that months, years, 5 years. Visa status is the actual time a border officer will let you stay in the United States on a specific trip. Obviously, when your visa validity period is expiring, you will need to apply for a new visa with the consulate.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's talk about, I think, one of the biggest issues that comes up with E-2 visas. How much investment do you need to get an E-2 visa?
Sure. So by law, there is no real required amount. What the applicant has to consider is that the money being invested has to be considered substantial. Again, not set by regulations or law. So what the substantial really means, it's going to depend on the type of business being started. So if we look at some examples, sort of like an office-based business, like a consulting business, it'll generally be expected that type of business will require a lower investment amount, probably around $40,000-$50,000 to start the business, since there probably not going to be that many upfront expenses to start it. You're probably looking at a lease for an office space and some computer equipment and perhaps some furniture. That's probably the typical expense for kind of like that office-based company. Now, if you're looking at something sort of like a factory, a manufacturing company, a store, those kind of businesses will require a much more substantial investment because they're going to probably require more expensive equipment, perhaps machinery, a larger space to warehouse inventory. So that investment is going to depend on what that business needs. And if it needs that more sophisticated or complex machinery or equipment, that's what's going to be expected to be invested for that company. On kind of like that note, there's something called the proportionality test, which is used for startup companies, where the government's going to be looking at how much money is invested for the business and compare it with how much money is typically needed to start a business. And that's basically what we just kind of went through a second ago. There's also that same proportionality test for buying the business, where now the government's going to look at the actual purchase price when the business is being acquired, and it'll compare it to what the fair market value is for that business. So that test will be comprised on that, based on that fair market value, to make sure that that investment was sufficient. So you're going to probably need, you look at perhaps an appraisal by an accountant to show that it was a business that was purchased at fair market value.
Perfect. Thank you. So on that, same note, we know kind of now how much we need to spend, or around how much we need to spend. What are some common E-2 visa expenditures? And can you talk a bit about kind of what are strong expenditures and what are weak expenditures?
Sure, absolutely. So typical or good expenditures, I mean, you're looking at probably the setting up of a website and the hosting of the website. Again, we discussed this a little bit before. If it's an office-based business, you're looking at the purchasing of computer equipment, printing equipment, scanners, tablets, iPads. Obviously, if it's a business, probably like a retail business, perhaps the purchase of inventory. Um, Furniture can be good. It can be a good investment or expense, but you have to kind of be careful with that because you have to make sure that that furniture is typically used for that business or that business purpose. Purchase of intellectual property, trademarks, money paid to employees if the business is already operating. So that kind of like that payroll or payment to independent contractors, even legal fees used to establish the business are usually looked at favorably. Lease agreements, we mentioned that before. You want to probably consider prepaying for rent to get kind of like those investment numbers to be more substantial. So you want to maybe pre-purchase a month, maybe a year worth of rent on the lease agreement to get that to help you with that kind of like that investment amount. Startup costs for the business entity, similar to computer expenses, office supplies, phones, utilities. There could be training courses as well. That could be a little bit more tricky because there could be some restrictions in that, but we could look at that. Licensing fees. If you're going to be in a trade show appearance, those fees could also be used. Obviously, purchase of real property, but it's got to be related to the business always, right? So that'll work as well. We also see sometimes a business trying to use or purchase a vehicle. That's going to again depend on the business. So you have to be able to show that that vehicle is going to be used for the purpose of that business. That's going to be an easy sell for cases where maybe it's a food delivery business, a taxi service, probably a maid or cleaning service where you have to haul around equipment, personnel. That makes sense. If it's more of a business of, if it's a purchase more of convenience, that's going to be a harder sell, probably not going to work. Software, advertising. So those are types of investments that'll probably work really well for the new business and the case. Weaker investments. We already talked about kind of like those weaker vehicle type investments. If you're going to try to use like travel related expenses, like coming to the US to set up the business, that's not going to really count. Client meals for clientele, probably not going to work. Entertainment on kind of like that same idea, that's not going to work. Or anything that's reimbursed, that's probably not going to work either.
Perfect. Thank you. So switching gears a little bit, kind of talking about some risky, things that can make cases riskier and things that come up a lot. People often ask, can you buy a business from a relative or a related party? And what are your thoughts on that?
I would say technically it's allowed, but that's more of like you mentioned, that's more of like a riskier type of endeavor. Because you're going to be exposing the case to more scrutiny by an examining immigration officer, because there's going to be some suspicion of perhaps even favoritism in the sale of that business. So we go back to that proportionality test for buying a business where the officer is going to be scrutinizing to make sure that business has been purchased at fair market value, that you're not getting kind of like that sweetheart deal or too much of a sweetheart deal. So we don't generally recommend it, but if you're going to go through with it, you definitely want to look into getting an appraisal or an evaluation by an accountant to try to document as much as possible that's it's a legitimate transaction, not sort of like a favor by a family member.
Perfect. No, fully agree with that. And so another kind of area I think, people often have questions about, it relates to the source of funds. So is it possible to, kind of source the money for the investment through either loans or gifts? And if so, how does that work?
Certainly. The basic answer is yes. Loans and gifts are acceptable. Some things to remember with respect to a loan is, Two things actually. First, you probably need to document the source of that loan. So kind of like what are those loan agreements? What are the terms of the loan? Especially with the filing with USCIS, they're going to want to look at those documents to make sure it's legitimate. And the other thing, you want to make sure that it's not secured by any kind of asset owned by the business. That's definitely not going to work. So it could be an unsecured loan, it could be credit cards, it could be something secured by an asset that's not owned by the business. That'll likely work as well. On the topic of the gift, those are perfectly acceptable as well. The only issue with a gift is that sort of like the donor has to also explain the source of the gift, where it's coming from, that there's no expectation of repayment, and that there has to be provided a gift letter showing that there's no expectation of repayment.
Perfect. Perfect. So I think now we're going to switch gears a bit. And John, there are some questions that you were going to ask me, I think, about the E-2.
Absolutely. So we'll go forward with that. So the one question that we typically get is, do you have to typically have employees before filing an E-2 visa?
Yeah, so this is a common question, and the answer is no. You do not have to have employees before filing an E-2 visa if you're filing for a startup. So when you're starting up a brand new company, to meet the marginality requirement, showing the business is going to support more than you and your family, you really need to have a strong 5-year business plan. And that 5-year business plan needs to include your hiring plan. So you need to show you're going to hire those employees, ideally at least 3 to 4 full-time employees by the end of year 5, but you don't need to have employees before you file the petition. That being said, it is very helpful if you do have them. And if you're in a situation, let's say you're purchasing a business from someone and that business has been running for a while, you would really only want to be purchasing that business if it already had a track record of having employees. So if you're purchasing a business that's been running and hasn't had employees, that's more of an uphill battle. That's where you're going to have to then include a business plan and show how you're going to change the structure of the company. So not required to have employees before you file for a startup, but you can be very helpful. And anecdotally, we know there are a couple of consulates that really, really prefer to see those employees before filing. So even though it's not required, it can be a helpful thing to do.
Understood. Got it. Now, do you have any ideas or some strategies to deal with what's considered a weaker case?
Sure, absolutely. So, I think that when we talk about a weaker case, in this situation, we're often talking about a lower investment amount. And then when we say low investment amount, we really mean, amounts kind of under 300,000, under 250,000 are considered lower investment amounts that we process quite a lot. I think when you do have a low investment amount, what you want to make sure is that all the other aspects of your case are as strong as possible. So you want to look at, do you have the good proof that your business is real and operating? Do you have client contracts? Do you have a strong marketing plan? Do you have marketing brochures? Have you developed a website? If your company is platform based in any way, do you have that platform set up? If you were you able to hire an employee? That can really help with the marginality aspect. Additionally, when you have that lower investment amount, it can be helpful to include, market reports or industry research that kind of confirm that the startup costs for your type of company are low. So there's many kind of trade publications out there that will talk about, startup costs for a marketing consultancy, and they're often well below 50,000. So if you're investing, upwards of 50,000 or around that amount, you're then able to argue that you've invested in excess of the total cost to set up the business. So I think all of those are really key to trying to make it stronger. And another thing just to keep in mind, though, is that using this lower investment amount, it has to make sense in light of your business, right? So as you talked about earlier, John, if you have a manufacturing type of company or in a company that requires, a factory or specialized equipment, you're not going to be able to get that approved with an investment of 50,000 because the startup costs are just more than that. But for these service-based companies that we're working with a lot, these lower investment amounts are often very doable because there is a very strong argument that if you spent $40,000, $50,000, and you have some amount in your business bank account, that you really have spent everything necessary to start up this type of company.
Yeah, very, very interesting how that works. And, there can be flexibility in there if the case is presented right. Interesting. Okay. So what do you think are common challenges, and perhaps even provide some tips for a consulting business?
Sure. So I think that, for consulting businesses, and we have many, many clients that are starting up consultancies of various kinds, and usually they come to us asking, how can I invest a substantial amount? I can work out of my home. I already own my computer. That's all I need. I have nothing I can invest. So I think that, you always want to think strategically about how to spend money in such a way that it'll be on things that are useful for you, right? So we don't want people to just kind of spend money to spend money. That being said, realistically, you cannot get an E-2 visa, just purchasing a computer. You are going to have to invest more than that. So we generally try to advise spending or at least up to 40,000. Ideally, maybe then you have additional money in the business bank account as working capital. You can spend money on things like office space. So even though you don't need an office space, perhaps it's better to have a business, mailing address. So even now, maybe you get a virtual office, or you pay for, a desk at WeWork, and you can prepay for that office space as well. Also computer equipment, for the E-2, you're going to have to hire employees. So even though maybe you would have held off on purchasing equipment for those employees for a couple of years, you can purchase that equipment now, to help get your investment amount up. Similarly, perhaps you would have waited to upgrade your website until you were operating for a few years, but instead, perhaps you make that investment now, so that you have a more upgraded website, and you're able to show that investment, to help your investment amount. You can also spend additional money on marketing, perhaps hiring a PR firm. This is another area where hiring employees is beneficial in multiple ways because it helps your marginality argument. And also, if you hire employees, any money that you pay to the employees, so if you hire them and they work for you, anything that you pay them can be part of your investment, as well as any ancillary expenses related to your employees. So if you have to hire a payroll service provider, if you have to get insurance, all of those things are great E-2 expenses and can help get your investment amount up and spent on things that are going to be necessary for you. So you're not just kind of feeling like you're throwing money away.
Sure.
I
No.
think, sorry, just one other thing in consulting businesses to keep in mind is that the big concern officers often have is that someone is going to come in and just be a solo consultant. And as you mentioned, John, like the E-2 is for people that want to develop a larger business and hire employees. It's not for someone to come in and engage in skilled labor in the US labor market. So what you want to make sure, as going in with a consulting company, is that you have a strong business plan that really shows you're going to hire employees. Perhaps you even hire one before you file, and that you have contracts and letters of intent. I think another concern they often have is there's tons of consultants, are you really going to be able to get work? So it's always very helpful for your case if you can go into the interview showing that you already have market interest in your business offering.
Yeah, certainly, because it shows legitimacy of the business, and it shows that potential of hiring employees, which is, I think, critical on the heart of these E-2 visa cases. Excellent.
Exactly.
Thank you, Kelly. Now, what do you think about real estate projects? Do you think they could make good E-2 visa cases?
So real estate projects are possible, but they are generally risky cases. I think anytime a consular officer kind of sees real estate involved, they're kind of going to perk up a little bit and they're going to scrutinize it more closely. Part of the reason is there's a common misconception that you can basically just purchase a property, put it in an LLC and use that as your E-2 investment. That is not permitted. And the reason is it's passive. So there's no real and operating company if you just have purchased a property. So for the E-2 requirement that the business be real and operating, you need to show that you're actually going to be providing a service, you're taking, or a good or a product, and you're taking in revenue. You have an active enough business, you can hire employees. So some potential real estate company ideas that have worked for our clients, so one is a real estate brokerage firm. Another is a real estate property management company. any kind of real estate renovation or construction companies. The other thing that can work sometimes under limited circumstances is house flipping. If you're doing this on a very small scale, like you have 2 properties, this is really not a good idea. When we say house flipping, we're really talking about large scale commercial real estate development. So for example, we have clients that have purchased and, renovated and flipped 50 to 60 houses, or are building a new, commercial, space and kind of renovating homes in that space, or, large apartment buildings with hundreds of units. So if you're going to be doing house flipping as your E-2 business, it needs to be done on a large scale. And you also have to keep in mind that increases the amount of investment you're going to need to show. Something that we have that has worked for our clients in the past is, let's say that the client wants to do house flipping, but they also want to do, renovation. So perhaps you focus the E-2 application really on the renovation business, which is more of a service offering, doesn't require as much startup. And you can put in your business plan that down the line, the company also plans to do some house flipping. So that's a way that you can sometimes work in house flipping if it's something you really want to do, but it really can't be your main service offering because you're not doing it on a very large scale. Another thing to consider with real estate is that all of these business ideas I just put out there are generally very heavily regulated, and it's state specific, right? So if you're doing construction in a particular state, often you need a general contractor, you need a license. If you're doing kind of, realtor, if you're working and doing, property management or work that needs a realtor. So you have to keep that in mind, about how you're going to deal with the license issue. Do you have appropriate licenses, or perhaps you partner with somebody who has the appropriate licenses until you can get them? But just something to keep in mind, because it is something that will come up often. They want to know, do you actually have permission to do this type of work, in the United States?
Certainly, always an eye towards legitimacy as well. Are there any other type of cases you consider risky for E-2 visas?
Yeah. So besides consulting and real estate, I think another risky area is kind of equity trading companies. So this is another thing that comes up a lot, where maybe somebody has been kind of trading in their personal stock portfolio, or perhaps for their family, or maybe a couple friends, and they want to see if they can turn it into a business. And there's a lot of similar concerns to real estate, in the sense that officers will wonder, is it really active enough to be considered real and operating? So in that sense, you want to have client contracts. You want to be able to show that you're going to do more than just be kind of trading your own personal money or the money of your family. You want to be able to show you're going to support, enough to hire employees. And again, it's a heavily regulated industry, so you want to make sure you have the right licenses to be able to do this.
Certainly. Thank you. Now, what have you seen as reasons for an E-2 visa denial?
So I think, several reasons kind of have come up, so one is low investment amount. So, we've talked at length about how you can kind of strengthen your case when you have a lower investment amount, but there are times when the investment amount is just too low. So for example, we had a former client who applied by themselves, and they paid $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. So that person just has not invested a substantial amount. $2,000 is just really never going to be considered substantial. It's not enough to get the business up and running to the point that it needs to be to get the E-2 visa. So, low investment amount can be, in that particular case, that had to be fixed by essentially spending more of the $98,000. That person did spend on various business expenditures, reapplied, and was approved. Other things you can do with low investment amount, like let's say maybe you spent $35,000 and you were denied for a low investment amount. Sometimes you can take alternate routes, such as getting those market research reports, getting those industry reports that, outline startup costs, and trying to compare that favorably with your investment. You may also get a CPA or an accountant who works kind of in your industry a lot to review your business plan and investment schedule, and write a letter confirming that the investment is substantial and sufficient to run this type of business. So those can be kind of some alternate strategies to try to address low investment amount. And then, of course, if you have additional funds to invest, that's something you can do as well, is, make those additional investments, and then just reapply with that higher investment amount. Other reasons for denial, sometimes it is the nature of the business. So we just talked about these risky businesses, with consulting, real estate, and equity trading. We've gotten all of those successfully approved in the past, but you do need to be aware of the pitfalls, and you do need to take those steps to make sure, if you're going in as a consultant and you have, your business plan's not that strong, maybe, you have a low investment amount, you don't have any client contracts, that's going to be a very, very risky case, not likely to succeed. So you really do need, when you have these risky cases, to take those extra steps, get the client contracts, get the supportive letters from other business organizations. Those are things that are really going to help your application when you're in a risky area. Other reasons for denial, sometimes it's an unfavorable filing location. There are some places that process a lot of E-2 visas. For example, Toronto and London, both process many, many E-2 visas. There are some places that do not process many E-2 visas and are not as familiar with the requirements. Additionally, consular officers move over time, and sometimes at various consulates, they get particular ideas in their head, like, well, it has to be any investment under 300,000 doesn't work. So that's something you always want to discuss with your attorney, because it is kind of a moving target in that sense. And there are times when certain consulates are less favorable than others. And if you do have options potentially, you want to discuss that, to see maybe if you can apply somewhere more favorable. Other denial reasons, concern about whether the business is going to create jobs for U.S. workers. So that's why it's important to have a strong business plan. Particularly, let's say that you ran a similar business in your home country for many years and you've never hired anyone. That can be a really big red flag, and your employment history is going to come up. It's on your DS-160 application. It's in your cover letter describing why you're able to run the business. So you do want to keep that in mind. Like, let's say you did have a really long history of running a company with no employees. That might push you towards really wanting to hire before you file, because the officer may not be convinced by your business plan if they say, yes, you say you're going to hire, but you ran a similar company for 10 years and you never did. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is just how important it is to show you're going to hire U.S. workers. Other things that can come up, sometimes you just have a bad officer. Sometimes, consular officers are people. You get one that's having either a bad day, or they misunderstand the application, or they're concerned about something. They do have complete discretion over the process. So we always recommend to our clients, be as courteous as you can, ask them what they were unhappy with, and you can always try to reapply. Consulates don't guarantee this, but they often will try to give you a different adjudicating officer the next time. So just something to keep in mind. And then the last I think we see is sometimes, particularly for people that have applied without an attorney, sometimes you just don't meet the requirements. So for example, if you are applying and you own 20% of the company, and the rest of the company is owned by a U.S. citizen, that just does not qualify. So that can be another issue, and is a reason why we would recommend that people hire an attorney for the process, just to help smooth the way.
Thank you, Kelly. Great points. Finally, would you be permitted to change your business after you start it?
So this depends on how much you're changing it. So if it is a non-substantive change, like let's say that you started up a restaurant and you're adding, a takeout bakery service, to your restaurant. That's really a pretty similar line of work. It's a pretty similar business, not really a substantial change. You were serving, food to customers. Now you're just adding a bakery component. But let's say that, you're running your restaurant and now you want to close it down and you want to start up a wedding photography business. So for that, yes, you would have to get approval before you can go ahead with that. It's not permitted to substantially change your business line entirely without any approval. So at that point, like if you were in the US and you want to change your business line, you have two options. One is you can reach back out to the consulate that originally approved your visa and see if they want additional documents. They may tell you, look, just reapply, send new documents for the new business. They may tell you you're in the US, deal with US citizenship and immigration services. And that's another option you have, is you could file with US Citizenship and Immigration Services and send them the new documents and say, hey, this is a substantial change. Please approve this. But the key is that you have to get that approval before you start your new business line. I think something that happens sometimes is that someone's running a business, it's not going well, they close down that business line and they think because it's the same entity, it's okay. But unfortunately, that's not the case. If your business has substantially changed and what it's doing from what you presented to the consulate or USCIS, you have to get that approval first.
Very
So
important.
I think those are all the questions we have, but we have a few questions that wrote in. So I thought maybe, John, we can answer a few of these. So the first one is someone is asking, they say there's money in the account. Is it supposed to be in my country account, or do I have to open a US account and deposit in there? I think, it seems like what they're asking is, do you need a US business bank account to apply for the E-2? Maybe you could address those, considerations.
Sure. No, not necessarily. I think what's important when we're talking about the money is what we discussed previously, that we want to document that it comes from a legitimate source. And then especially with USCIS filings, you want to make sure you document kind of like that money trail. As long as everything looks per se legitimate and the money trail is clear, that's really the primary requirement when it comes to the money. Where the money is actually sitting, obviously, other than the actual investment of the money, right? So whether it's being spent from your country of nationality or it's being spent from an account in the US, I don't think really matters. It's just what really matters is that it's documented properly and that the expense is properly documented.
Absolutely, fully agree. I think one other consideration, though, is it can be beneficial to have a US business bank account from the real and operating side of things. So John's absolutely right. You don't have to transfer your money to the United States. You can have the money in your account and spend for the E-2 from your personal accounts, or from a bit, if you set up your US account there, your business account there. But I will say, we strongly recommend to our clients that you're going to set up a US business bank account to show that you are actually getting the business up and running, because generally to do business in the US, you are going to need that business bank account. So it's not a requirement that you open one, but it certainly would make your case stronger. Perfect. So somebody's asking, if I go B1, B2 as a Canadian to the US, can you apply for an E-2 from the United States? So yes, this is possible. You can do something called a change of status, as long as you have a valid I-94, you've entered, you have, proof of that. If the investment amount is less, like 50,000, will it work? This is going to depend on the type of many factors. So what type of company are you starting? What the investments are made on. I will say, if you apply with USCIS, they're generally okay with lower investment amounts. But it's very, fact specific and case dependent. The other thing to consider is that if you apply with USCIS, they take a very, very strict view of the source and trail of funds. So that's, in Canada, you're really going to have a much easier path. If it's personal savings from employment, show some tax return, show your bank statement. For USCIS, they want to see an exact trail of where all the money came from. So that's just something to keep in mind with the USCIS filing. Someone's indicated they're interested in knowing more about setting up and operating a trucking business. We have done trucking businesses for E-2, so that is a viable idea. If you have specific questions, I'd encourage you to set up a consult with us, and we can certainly talk through those questions. So John, a question for you. Someone wants to apply as a consultant. Is a business coach a legitimate expense towards initial investment? When does the money need to be spent? Someone's been setting up slowly over the past 2 years.
Sure. So it could be probably a legitimate business expense. I mean, the key with these applications is you do need to explain what the services that you're offering. So a clearer case is a kind of business that traditionally does exist in the mainstream, right? So if it exists in the mainstream, it's something that you can compare your business to. That's probably not gonna have too much of a problem. If it's something that's out of the ordinary, something that's super creative, it could still work. But you're going to have to do some more heavy lifting and explaining what the nature, the purpose, and the services that business is going to be providing to the examining officer.
I think also though, I
Mhm.
may be misunderstanding the question, John, but I think also someone's asking, like, let's say that I'm starting up a company and I'm paying a business coach to help me set up my company. Can I use that as part of my investment?
Yeah, I believe so. As long as it's being used towards helping in the setup and the starting of the business, I think it certainly should be a legitimate business expense. Now, when to spend the money? I mean, it should be done. It has to be done before you're applying for the visa. I mean, I think that's basically the basic answer to that question. I think it's okay if you've been working on setting it up for some time. Again, what's key is documentation and able to document that money that's being spent towards that business.
Absolutely. Yeah, fully agree. And I think as well, like, can you say I bought this laptop 2 years ago? Here's my proof of payment for it. Yes, you absolutely can, and you can include that. I think it's just you don't want most of your investments to be the older they get, the more difficult it can kind of become to show, that it was necessary. So if you spent something 4 years ago, maybe it's not as strong, but you can include it. You just want to also have more recent expenses, I think. Um, so someone's asked, I currently operate a business in Canada. Would opening a subsidiary in the US be considered legitimate for an E-2? Yes, that is possible. There's, many times when a company abroad is going to open a subsidiary. The key if it's a company is you have to trace the ownership back to the individuals. So if you own a business in Canada and you own it 100%, and then that business, your Canadian business is going to own the US business 100%, then that will work because it's a treaty, the company has treaty nationality based on the chain of ownership. But you just have to consider who owns the company and are they treaty nationals? And then someone's asked, what's the longest you can get for the E-2 visa as a Canadian citizen? And yes, the answer is 5 years. Canadian nationals can get a 5-year E-2 visa. So John, someone's asking about minimum amounts for a trucking business. I think you covered this earlier in terms of there really is no minimum, there is no minimum amount. I think a trucking business actually is going to have significantly higher startup costs, depending on how it's structured. I think the ones that we've done in the past have been quite high because people, if you're starting from scratch, you need to own, you need to purchase trucks, to make that work. So it really depends like on how you're running it. If you're a dispatcher and you don't need truck, that's just really going to depend on the type of business you're starting up. And that conversation is really best, I'd say, had during a consult so we can go over the specific details of your situation. All right. So we have one last question. What is the path from E-2 to residency or citizenship? So there is no, as with all non-immigrant visas, there's no kind of immediate path to a green card. So similarly, can E-1 be converted to a green card? No. What the E visa is a non-immigrant visa. What it means is while you're in the United States, if there is a green card category available to you, you can apply for that green card category while you're here. So if you're on an E-2 visa and let's say you marry a US citizen, you can apply for a green card. If you are, if you're in the US on an E-2 visa and you are working with a company that decides to sponsor you for, through a perm for an employer sponsored green card, you can apply. Sometimes for E-2s, they can eventually invest enough money to get up to EB-5 level, where you're investing, maybe up to $1 million, 50,000 to get, to get a green card that way. So the paths will depend on exactly what type of green card you are interested in and that you might qualify for, but there's no kind of conversion from the E to any particular green card category. All right, so I think someone's talking about we currently operate a business, buy properties, high expenditures, setting up existing properties and more to invest. Can we include some or all of the income of our property income and our future income? I'm not sure what this question is asking, but for questions that are this specific, that are talking about, specific details, I'd say the best thing to do is to set up a consultation. Spouses of E-1 visa holders can work in the US. And someone's asking about how often we do the webinars. If you go to our website and under events, all the webinars are listed, and we do offer webinars that talk about EB-5. So please keep an eye out for those. All right. Someone's looking to open a subsidiary and owns the Canadian company 100%. Do you need so the LLC in the US will be equal 50% ownership with your mother. I'm not sure exactly how that structure would work, but yes, if you both want to come to the United States and work at the company, you would both need E-2 visas. Short-term rentals, Airbnbs, John, are these good E-2 companies?
Well, I think similar to your explanation of perhaps rental properties, or real estate properties, very risky. Again, if it's a larger endeavor, several Airbnbs, several rental properties, that's more solid ground on these type of cases. But if it's just one or two properties, that's probably not going to work.
Right, exactly. I think, right, need to do larger scale and have kind of perhaps a different service offering. Someone's talking about an essential employee. For an essential employee, like let's say you're Canadian and you are an investor, you can bring over other Canadians. So it has to be a national of Canada, and you have to show that they have specialized skills. You have to show how long you're going to need them for. Is it a short-term need, a long-term need? And you also need to show, why is it that you can't find someone in the US who has the same skill set? And then someone's asking, is the NIW visa in the E category? So no, in the sense that they're just two completely separate visa categories. Can E-2 visa holders potentially qualify for a national interest waiver? Yes, potentially they can, if they meet the national interest waiver criteria. So we have actually completely separate webinars that are on the national interest waiver category. I think if you're just an E-2 business owner and that's, you just own a business and run your business and it's a good business, I think that's generally not really enough for the national interest waiver. You need to show that your endeavor has substantial merit and national importance. I think many business owners can potentially meet this NIW criteria, but it really depends on exactly what your business is doing, what your business is offering. Are you doing something that is, changing, very important in your industry, making, industry-wide changes that are more efficient, more effective? Are you working in an area of critical importance for the United States? Those are the types of things that, potentially could, come up for the NIW. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in that, to view our webinars on national interest waiver, as they go into much more detail and talk more about how potentially entrepreneurs can qualify. All right, so I think we have no more questions. John, thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge. I hope it was helpful for everybody. It was, really lively questions. Great participation from everyone. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.